All right. Hello, everybody. Good to be back with you for another week of our study of Mama Bear Apologetics together. Chapter 6 this week, looking at the idea of naturalism. So it's a pretty heady chapter. I know some of this book has already been pretty heady, but this week we actually start getting into a little bit more of what is traditionally known as apologetics, some of the big arguments about the faith. And so, what has been the goal of this video each week with you guys has been to, as you're reading it, as you're talking about the ideas, just give some insight, a little bit of background, maybe offer some context to help you think it through. And I think this is a good week to do that, as there is some pretty deep stuff. So I'm going to do my best to work through it real quickly with you and just hopefully answer some of the questions that you might have got from the text, the book. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, kind of let you know what's being discussed. So let's kind of start here. Where the author of the book starts is with this idea of naturalism. And that's a word that has been very common for the last couple hundred years. Maybe you don't hear it quite as much nowadays, but it's still out there quite a bit. And naturalism can be defined simply this way. Naturalism is the belief that everything that happens through what we would call natural causes, meaning there are no supernatural. There's nothing outside of nature. There's nothing beyond what we can know and see verifiably by testing things and looking at things, what science, the observable, reveals to us. That's all there is. That's it. Now, some people will go as far as to say naturalism is just the way it is. It's proof. There's no proof for it, but some people definitely hold to it. Now, the thing with naturalism, it's important to know this, is, and we'll get into this a little bit more, your book does, that naturalism has a basic assumption. If nothing is outside of nature, well, that rules out God. So Christianity and naturalism are at odds. And so obviously, as Christians, we want to address the issue, face it head on, and talk about it together. And that's what this chapter does. I think it does pretty well. It also does it fairly quickly. So, we have to kind of get through it. It's a short chapter. But a few things I want to touch on. The first is I like how one of the initial ideas that came in the chapter is this tension between science and faith. And she quotes a famous atheist known as Richard Dawkins, who often argues against Christianity. And Dawkins calls faith the great cop-out. And she quotes Mark Twain as well, who says, "Faith is believing what ain't so." It's this idea that faith is essentially the choice to put on blinders and just accept things with no rational reason or evidence. And so there's often this tension where naturalism is the reliance on observing things and seeing things, and we can test it. We see what our brain says. And faith and Christianity and religion is the rejection of that and just wanting to believe in willy-nilly things that don't make any sense anymore. And it's blind. And the reality is, and I think your book does a good job, and I want to hit on it, obviously, is number one, that's just not true. And so we'll talk about that. And number two, it's also a misunderstanding what faith is. And they touch on it briefly, but faith is not primarily even belief at all. That's kind of a mistranslation of the word in some ways. Faith, literally at its most basic, means to trust. And trust is something that happens when you get to know. It's like in a relationship. I trust you because I know you. I have some relational capital with you. I've seen you come through, and so therefore I trust you. So to have faith in someone isn't blind, and to have faith in anything isn't blind. It's there's a reason for me to trust this. So putting faith in God is not blind. It's not, well, I'm just going to turn my brain off and just trust. That's not what faith means. And I don't even think the scriptures call for that. They call us to think and reason, use it. So right off the bat, there's a problem. But let's back up. And your text kind of talks about three periods or ages of humanity. And they cover the first two, and then I think we'll cover the newest one, recent one later. But they start with what's called the pre-modern times. And pre-modern, just to be clear, is most of human history. If we're on a timeline, it's like all of this and then this. We're pre-modern essentially is everything before what we would call the scientific revolution, which happened in the 16, 17, 1800s and has continued. Everything before modern science was pre-modern. And what dominated pre-modernism was two things. One was what we would call superstition. In pre-modernism, everything that happened in nature and in my life and in the world around me happened because there was some sort of supernatural being, demons, angels, gods outside that were making it all happen. I mean, everything. The sun rose, the rain fell, you got sick. I mean, when you sneezed, you were exorcising demons, bless you. Everything had a supernatural cause before it. And obviously, before Christianity, you have all the ancient cultures attributed everything in their world to the gods. And literally everything. To get pregnant, a god helped you. To your crops to grow, the gods helped you. Anytime you got sick, everything was supernatural. And along with that was an acceptance of authority. The people who were in touch with the gods, so before like Christianity, the priests or whatever, they're the ones that said what the gods wanted. And even for a lot of times in Christianity or other religions, it was like, okay, the priest or the rabbi or whatever is the one that's telling me, and I'm just accepting it, and I'm not asking a lot of questions. That was the pre-modern age. But that all began to change around the 1700s with the introduction of this thing that we've come to call science and reason and rationality, which call us to absolutely ask questions, to not just take things because somebody said so, but to say, hold on, well, don't just tell me this, prove this to me. The heart of science was, I want to observe it and test it and see if it's true for myself, not just accept it because somebody said it. And this ushered in what became known as the modern era. So the word modern era around the 17th century was where humanity was moving out of just accepting everything was superstitious and supernatural and moving to a place of saying, well, hold on, no, there are actually natural reasons for a lot of these things. It isn't raining because one of the gods is crying. It's raining because of, moisture and evaporation and clouds and all these things. We began to understand the human body. We began to understand the world around us. We began to understand nature. And we began to see that there are reasons for why things happen. And it wasn't just because of deities or gods or these kind of things. So modernism called us to embrace science, that we can make sense of our world. We don't need supernatural reasons. And we can study things. We can ask things for ourselves. Now, just to be clear, and this is important, and it's helpful for you to know this, it's helpful for your kids. The idea of us being able to study and use science is not and never was anti-Christian. In fact, almost all of the original scientists that started it were Christians. Isaac Newton was a Christian. Galileo was a Christian. These people, Pascal, believed that a rational, logical God created all things, and therefore we should be able to study it and make sense of what he created. That not everything was just weird and rampant and a bunch of different gods. No, one God who is logical and rational created everything so we can study it and know it. So the heart of science is a belief that there is a God who created things rationally. What happened, though, is suddenly, maybe not suddenly, but over the course of time, suddenly in grand history, you began to see a movement away from saying, because there's a God, I can study science and find out the natural means that he created, to what we call naturalism, which is essentially, I don't need a God at all. Nature can be explained completely by itself. I don't need a higher power or being. I can just say, no, nature, all the answers I need are in nature. So naturalism is different than science. And that's why I want to use those. Science is simply studying the world around you, right? Naturalism is a worldview. It's a belief. Anybody could study science. You can believe anything and study science. Naturalism is an assumption that only natural things exist. Those two things are different. So naturalism wants to say there's nothing supernatural. Everything that happens has a natural explanation. Nothing exists outside of nature. Nature is all there is, and therefore there's no God. There are no miracles. None of that kind of happens, which obviously is a problem for Christians. So again, notice the difference. Science, many Christians. Naturalism, not Christian at all. Now, one of the things that I enjoyed about your book is they do get into what we call apologetics a little bit, and they start to kind of dive into some of the apologetic questions that defending faith and different things people argue and go through. And one of the biggest ones they hit on, because it is one of the biggest ones, is when you try to explain everything naturally, when you say there are no above extra natural explanations, eventually you come to a problem. And that problem is a modern day argument that religious people make when arguing with atheists. And it has a really big word. I'll teach you this. Ready? It's the cosmological argument. Cosmological. If you can remember that word and go home and you'll impress people. Cosmological. Cosmo is the word for universe or world, everything exists. The logic of the universe. And the cosmological argument basically goes like this in its simplest terms. It says, everything that exists because something brought it into existence. Think of the word we might use is like a phrase, a chain reaction. And one of the ancient philosophers, a guy named Aristotle, he talked about this idea, and he looked around and said, anything that's moving, just think about it, if something is moving, if you see something moving, if it's in motion, your brain tells you something pushed it, right? Nothing goes into motion by itself. So that means everything and everything in our world is moving, everything's in motion. So that means there had to be some point where something put it into motion, but was itself not put into motion. And essentially what he used this word was first cause. And so we take that argument, we pull it back and we say, everything in our world around us came from something else, right? We see that humans came from embryos and plants and all these different things. Everything has a cause. Every effect you see has a cause. Nothing just everything came from something else. So if I keep tracing it back, what caused this? Or what caused this? Or what caused this? Well, eventually I'm going to come to a point of saying, what caused any of it? Why is the universe here? Why is anything here? Why does stuff exist at all? That's the cosmological argument. And naturalism and Christianity and religion kind of butt heads here, because one of the biggest problems with naturalism, the belief that there are no extra outside of nature causes, is where did nature come from? If there's only nature, why is nature even here? Why is there a universe at all? And there will be a lot of different answers to this. Famous guys like Carl Sagan said, well, the universe is eternal. It just always existed. It just always was. Well, if you think about that, if you want us to believe that the universe just always existed, that's kind of a statement of faith, isn't it? I mean, why would it just always exist? That seems hard to believe. Is it more rational to believe it always existed, or that there was a pre-existent creator who brought it into being? And people say, like, well, you Christians believe that, there's a God who was uncreated. I'm like, well, naturalists believe that something was uncreated. You believe something, both of us believe there's something that has always existed and didn't need to be created. We call that God. Other people talk about a multiverse. Maybe there's tons of different universes all together, and we're just one of them. And this comes from another big argument called the teleological argument. Teleological means from the word telos, which is like an end or a purpose, that it seems like the universe is perfectly fine-tuned in order for us to arrive at life. Like everything seemed perfectly set up. And this is something that scientists struggle with a lot today who aren't religious. They're like, we're not quite sure what to do with the fact that everything is so perfectly aligned. And so Christians will come in, and not even just Christians, but Muslims and Jews and others will say, hey, look at this. The universe is so perfectly aligned, and it's here, and it's perfect in order for us to exist. How do you explain that? And to be a naturalist and say there are everything is a natural cause, you'd be like, well, I can't really give that a natural cause. So one of the ideas is, well, we're just lucky. Okay, well, that's faith. Or there's millions and billions of universes, and we're just the luckiest one. We happen to be the one that was perfectly aligned, and we're here. But again, where did all those universes come from? Naturalism always comes to a point of, if there's nothing beyond nature, where did nature come from? Now, that was a lot. Let's be honest, that was heavy. Some of you might be hearing that, you're like, what? It's okay. But I just wanted you to think of things that are in motion. Like if you see a pool ball rolling on a table, your assumption is another pool ball hit it. It's a cause and effect. And that's what we're arguing for. Naturalism wants to say there's only the pool table. The only thing that exists is the pool table and the balls that are on the table. Nothing else exists. But the balls are actually rolling and hit each other. Why? How is that possible? And theists, those who believe in God, want to say because there's actually something outside of nature. There's something outside of the pool table that is hitting them and causing them to move and putting them there in the first place. So naturalism versus that. Now, All that being said, you might forget all of that. It's okay. But really, the bigger issue here, and this is the big point that I want to hit on, and I thought that the book did a great job with it. The book calls us to number one, remember, recognize the message. We're identifying the messages. And the main message that's coming here with naturalism is that we don't need a God because science explains everything. Again, it's not science versus God, it's naturalism versus God. You don't need a God because science explains everything. And there's the example of how the old Scooby-Doo cartoon, at the end of every Scooby-Doo cartoon, they find out it's not really a ghost or a monster, it's just Farmer Jim. And eventually science will explain everything because nature's all there is. That's a message that's coming to us. And as we've talked about every week, the goal here is to hear the message and not just kick it all out, but to look for the good. And there is good here, okay? There is good. And you'll hear me all the time talk about that. First of all, we shouldn't believe everything we're told. Science is great. Science has made our world better in real, tangible ways. Thank God for dentists and plumbing, like science, right? Good. Thank God that we don't, leech each other now when we're sick. We understand there are ways to actually. So we shouldn't. I don't think we should want to live in a world where anything we don't understand, we just immediately say it's a demon or an angel or the work of the gods. No, that isn't the world that God created. It doesn't give him glory, and it doesn't help our lives, and he wants to help our lives. So God gave us science. God gave us the ability to study his world. And the world is amazing, and it calls for us to study and figure it out. We should totally want our kids to get into science. We should encourage science. We should be like, science is amazing. Spend all the time you want studying this incredible thing that God made. Medicine, psychology, technology, all of it. Go for it. Study it, embrace it. Science is a good thing, and we should never talk to our kids and make them think it's not. We should never pit science against God because those two are never against each other. Science is something that God gave us because he gave us brains. If you raise your kids to fear science and to shun it, you're going to create problems. You're either going to create these like closed-minded kids that don't, have any idea about the world, or eventually they're going to ask the questions themselves and they're going to find answers in science from people who aren't coming from a position of faith, and they're going to screw your kids up. Embrace science. Study, go get it. And even with that, I like how your book kind of even evolution. Listen, I don't want to get into it here, but I do get into it in my podcast. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can just look at a few of the videos there. The one I did most recently, I called it "No Dinosaur Bones About It." I think evolution has something to teach us, and I think oftentimes maybe what I personally believe is not always the best reading of Genesis 1 has led us to pit science and God against each other when they're not. And so if you have any questions, or if you are like, well, how do I take all this with creation and things? Check out the podcast this week on Like Star's podcast. What I talk about reading Genesis, not from a naturalistic anti-God, but from the perspective of what does this mean? How does it go about it? What does it mean in light of what God has given us for science? So embracing science is a good thing. Accepting that God wants us to study and make sense of the world around us is what we receive. But what do we kick out? What do we spit out, right? Here's the things that I think we kick out of this message. Number one, science and Christianity are not at odds. Naturalism and Christianity are at odds. It is not science. It's not studying nature that has something against Christianity. And Christians should never have any problem with studying nature and science. Science is, amazing. It's beautiful. The issue is naturalism. When science gets hijacked by people who have an agenda to tell us there's no God, when science gets used for the purpose of trying to disprove God, it's become something else. It's become naturalism. And the problem is, because so many people have done that, because so often science has been used to try to, there's no God, we have science, we stopped rejecting naturalism and we threw out the whole thing, right? We saw there was a problem, but instead of taking out the problem, naturalism, we threw out science altogether. And Christians were like, science, no. Science and Christianity are not at odds. And again, I would also say part of this can be the tension of reading Genesis 1. And I don't think that's a tension. I explain why in my other podcast. Another thing we need to kick out is that science uses facts, but Christianity uses faith. Well, science is all about facts, but you Christians are just faith. First of all, that's a misunderstanding of faith. And it gives science too much credit, because what we call science often uses what we call faith. Scientists don't know as nearly as much as they often say. They talk as if they know. And we kind of learned that during COVID, didn't we? We're learning it more and more. Science is not an exact art. There are many things in science that we take on faith and kind of trust that this seems reasonable, but we don't have absolute proof for. But on the other hand, Christianity itself is based on historical facts. Christianity is not based on just made up myths that we have no proof for. We have tons of evidence for the historical realities of Christianity. So both science and Christianity rely on facts, and both science and Christianity often rely on faith. Again, they're not opposed, and they're not as far apart as we sometimes want to say they are. And then the last one is that, well, science will eventually explain away everything supernatural. Eventually science will explain it. It may not explain it, but eventually explain it. Well, it hasn't so far. And I think we can safely say there's some things that science simply will never explain. And some of your future chapters get into that. But again, those kind of things are just pitting science against Christianity. There's nothing in science that disproves religion. Science has never offered a single piece of evidence that would make me question my commitment to Jesus. The only time and place that might ever happen is a literal reading of Genesis 1, which, again, bring it up again. If that's a tension for you, check out my other podcast this week. But again, science and Christianity are not at odds. We don't have to tell our kids they're at odds. What we have to do is we have to teach our kids that there's good in science, but it's naturalism that's the problem. It's the assumption that people bring to science that there's no God and science will answer all my questions. Science will not answer all your questions. And essentially, science has shown it won't answer our questions because amidst the hundreds of years of the scientific revolution, we still question morality. What is good? We still question purpose. We still have come to the point of maybe we don't really know anything. And that leads us to an era beyond modernism called postmodernism, which we'll get into the future. So science, Christianity, they're not at odds. Naturalism is the problem. And that's a message that we have to take in, keep the good, and spit out the bad. So hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, again, feel free to email me, pete@risingchurch.com. Whatever, I'm here however I can help. And looking forward to connecting with you guys again. Hope this was beneficial. Thanks, guys.